Hello and welcome in today's session. Today we shall be talking about forest policies during colonial period and independent India. Dear friends, we have learnt in previous lecture about the changing patterns of resource utilization embedded in the man-forest relationship over a period of time. It helps us to comprehend the structure and impact of man's activities on forests over a period of time and discern the forces of continuity and change in the period under discussion. In previous lecture, we have learnt about the changing resource values of forests, and in current lecture, we will focus on the policies and the legislations in accordance with the changing notions of resource exploitation. Forest policies, a politico-legal analysis. From a rich source of forest wealth in the pre-independence period, India has been reduced today to a position of minimal forest cover. Reckless exploitation coupled with absence of a comprehensive policy has led to a massive shrinkage in forest resource. The need for a national policy governing all aspects of forest management become pertinent. The formulation of a suitable forest policy began in the colonial period itself. From the establishment of the Forest Department in 1857, the National Forest Policy 1988, India has come a long way trying to cope with the problem of declining forest cover. The colonial background. Motivated apparently by exploitative reasons, the British laid the foundation of a forest policy in India. The ever-expanding British Empire was faced with a forest resource crunch. In a pre-industrial society like India, agriculture and forest had to bear the brunt of the burden. In order to rationalize their unbridled exploitation, as well as to appease the voices of opposition both within and outside the officialdom, the British took some measures that were given the shape of policy. The major milestones in the evolution of forest policies under the British rule and in independent India are establishment of the Forest Department, stating forest administration up to the 1857 rebellion, a melancholy failure. The Governor General of India, Lord Dalhousie, called for establishment of a department. The motive behind such a step was to ensure a sustained supply of timber for the railways. The Imperial Forest Department was formed in 1865, and Dietrich Brandes, a German botanist, was appointed as the first Inspector General of Forest. First Indian Forest Act 1865. This act empowered the forest officials to issue local rules for conserving Indian forests. Hurriedly drafted, this act was the first attempt by the state to assert its monopoly. It was primarily passed to facilitate the acquisition of the forest area that had been earmarked for the supply of railways. Indian Forest Act 1878. The Forest Act of 1865 had been drafted in a haphazard manner and thus had many shortcomings. Immediately after its enactment, therefore, the search began for more comprehensive piece of legislation. A preliminary draft prepared by Brandes was circulated for discussion. A conference of forest officers was convened in 1875 to frame a new act. The positions that were three in number cropped up during the deliberations on the proposed act. Number one, annexationists wanted total state control over the forest area. The pragmatists argued for state management of ecologically sensitive and strategically valuable forests, allowing others to remain under communal system of management. The third position, often called the populist position, completely rejected all forms of state intervention, holding that tribals and peasants must exercise sovereign rights over woodland. The matter was finally resolved in favor of the annexionists. The concrete proposal was embodied in Brandeis Memorandum of 1875, formed the basis of 1878 Act. It classified the forests into three categories: reserved forest, protected forests, village forests, reserved forest. In such forests, which were compact and connected to the towns, a legal separation of rights was aimed at. A permanent settlement either extinguished all private rights or transferred them elsewhere, or in exceptional circumstances allowed their limited exercise. Protected forests. These were also controlled by the state. The state control was firmly maintained by outlining detailed provisions for the reservation of a particular tree species as and when they became commercially viable, and for closing the forest whenever required for grazing and fuel wood collection. Village forests. Such forests was under the control of the villages and used by their inhabitants. The new legislation greatly enhanced the punitive powers of the forest officials and prescribed a comprehensive set of penalties for violation of the Act. Forest Policy, 1894. In 1894, the British government issued a circular that formed the basis of the future forest policy. Again, while reiterating the proprietary rights of the state, the policy also sought to administer the forests for the benefit of the taxpayers and the people living in the vicinity of the forests. One very harsh feature of this policy was the fact that forest preservation was placed secondary to agriculture. Besides, a fourfold classification of forests was also made. Forests, mainly hill slopes, the preservation of which is important on physical and climatic grounds. Forests which offered a supply of valuable timbers for commercial purpose. Minor forests generally meant to meet the fuel, fodder and timber requirements of the dependent communities. Pasture lands to cater to the needs of the local population. The government also tried to set up institutes to promote better utilization of forest resources. Thus, a forest school was established at Dehradun in 1878 for the training of forest rangers. This school received the status of a state forest college in 1906, after which forest officers also began to receive training in India. Indian Forest Act of 1927. This was the first comprehensive piece of legislation on forests under the British rule. Prior to its enactment, the general law relating to forest in British India was contained in the Indian Forest Act 1878 and its amendments. It was an act to consolidate the law relating to the forests, the transit of forest produce and the duty leviable on timber and other forest produce. Some of the basis features of the 1927 Act are: it enhanced the powers of the state to create reserve forests, village forests and protected forests, provided state regulation of the timber and non-timber forest produce, prescribed penalties for the violation of the Act, formalized the duties and powers of forest bureaucracy. The British forest policies were conditioned by utilitarian goals. Use rather than conservation was the keynote of the colonial policy. Thus, under the garb of promoting the interests of the people and the welfare of the nation, what the British actually did was a ruthless exploitation of the forests. Extraction of timber, both quantitatively and qualitatively was carried out mercilessly. Expansion of agriculture and the cost of forest cover was a blatant device to maximize revenue for the expanding empire. Further, the policies promulgated by them had several shortcomings. There was no provision for development of forest infrastructure or forest-based industries. While the tribals and rural population were divested of their customary rights, no attempt was made to control or regulate the forests of the native state and the zamindars. Wildlife protection was never important for them. Forestry research and education, however, was one aspect which was never followed as a long-term positive policy, resulting in an increase in the forest field. Independent India. India inherited the Colonial Forest Policy 1894 and the Indian Forest Act 1927. However, circumstances had changed by then, and the spatial and temporal context of the older legislation had been altered. Population had increased substantially, and so had the attendant demands of fuel, wood, fodder, timber, etc. Urbanization and industrial development had also increased, as had the defense requirements. Added to this was the growing realization of forest as essential to the physical and climatic balance of a country. This assumed particular importance in the context of two factors. Firstly, rapid deforestation during the two world wars by the colonial state, and secondly, the reckless exploitation of private forests by native states and zamindars during the last years of British rule. The situation called for a change in approach. Forests had to be brought in the realm of planned economic development. It was admitted by the planners that per capita forest area and per capita consumption of groundwood, pulp, etc. was poor. A need therefore was felt for an increase in overall coverage and even regional distribution of forest. A change in approach was what was required. A chronological account of the efforts made in this direction follows. Central Board of Forestry, 1950. The starting point of the new approach was the constitution of Central Board of Forestry, or CBF, to guide the government in the formulation of various policies and programs. This body became the supreme advisory body for the revision of the old forest policy. The meeting and recommendations of the Central Board resulted in the pronouncement of the National Forest Policy on May 12, 1952. National Forest Policy, 1952. The preamble of the National Forest Policy 1952 spelled out 6 supreme needs for the formulation of the policy. 1. Balanced and complementary land use. 2nd, checking denudation in the mountainous regions, erosions along big rivers and invasion of the sea lands on the coastal tracts. Balanced physical and climatic conditions, that was the 3rd point. And 4th was supply of progressively increasing demands of grazing, firewood, small wood for agricultural implements. And the 5th point was timber and other forest products for the requirements of defense, communication, and industry. And the 6th point was maximization of annual revenue in perpetuity consistent with the fulfillment of the 6 vital needs. Principles of the National Forest Policy, 1952. The new forest policy presented a functional clarification of the state privately owned forests as followed: protected forests, national forests, village forests, and tree lands. This classification was more comprehensive than the 1894 classification and had no relation whatsoever with the classification of forests under the Indian Forest Act of 1927. The policy also observed that the villagers residing in the vicinity of the forest should be permitted to use minor forest products in a restricted way. There was to be no diversion of forest land for agricultural purposes anywhere in the country. The need for controlling sand dunes in Rajasthan was emphasized, as was checking of erosion and denudation along susceptible regions. The policy also expressed the desirability to expand forest tree cover on lands owned by government and public as well by private institutions. The policy also advocated that one-third of the geographical area of the country should have forest cover, and further suggested that mountainous regions which was more prone to erosion and denudation should have 60% area under forests, whereas the plains can have 20% forested area. Forest Conservation Act 1980. This act was a departure from the existing utilitarian forest policy aimed at conservation. The basic objective of the act was to limit the power of the state governments to de-reserve forests or divert forest land for non-forest purposes. Under the provisions of the Act, prior approval of the central governments was required for diversion of forest land for non-forest purposes. This Act was amended in 1988 and some new provisions were added. In the meanwhile, N.D. Tiwari Committee that was constituted in February 1998 to examine the adequacy of the existing administrative, legal and institutional arrangements for protecting environment. The committee noted that the commercial interests and the needs of the poor for essential fuel and fodder contributed to the denudation of forests and regulation. It thus recommended the inclusion of fuel and fodder supply in the minimum needs program. In 1982, two themes were retreated, like conservation for environmental and ecological needs and for preservation of wildlife and genetic resources, and development for rehabilitation of forests and wildlife, for enlarging the resource base through afforestation and social and farm forestry programs. Further, it was decided that forest lands would be used for preserving soil and water systems and not for generating state incomes. All supplies to the market and industry would be met from farm forestry. Small and marginal farmers would be especially encouraged to use their degraded lands for meeting commercial requirements. National Forest Policy 1988. The inadequacies and shortcomings of the 1952 policy, coupled with the realization that it had been unable to address the multifarious issues of independent India on a long-term basis, called for a revision in the existing forest policy. The Estimates Committee 1968-69 of the 4th Lok Sabha in its 76th report expressed the opinion that a reprisal of the National Forest Policy 1952 should be made by an ad hoc body of experts in the light of experience gained during the years of development plans and research and technologies advance made in the field of forestry. Subsequently, the National Commission on Agriculture 1976 advocated that there were two important points on which the national forest policy should rest. One, meeting the requirements of industrial wood for forest-based industries, defense, communications, and other public purposes, as well as fuel wood and fodder for the rural community. The second point was meeting the present and future demands for protective and recreative functions of forests. The Commission recommended a change of strategy from a more conservation-oriented forestry to a more dynamic program of production forestry. The future production programs were to concentrate on clear felling of valuable mixed forests, mixed quality forest, and inaccessible hardwood forest, and planting these areas with suitable fast-growing species yielding higher returns per unit area and people's demand. Mainly, villagers and tribals had to be accommodated in order to save forests through social forestry on village and private lands or on growing trees on lands accessible to village people. The Government of India facilitated the implementation of the policy by issuing a resolution on June 1, 1990. The June 1990 guidelines make it possible for the Forest Department to involve people in the management of forest. In 1992, some amendments were made in the Act that made provisions for allowing some non-forest activities in forests without cutting trees or limited cutting with prior approval of central government. These activities are setting up of transmission lines, seismic surveyors, exploration, drilling, and hydroelectric projects. The last activity involves large-scale destruction of forest for which prior approval of the central government is necessary. The Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has notified the Forest Conservation Rules 2022. The primary objective of the policy is to safeguard the territory and integrity of the forests and maintain an ecological balance for every flora and fauna to sustain. It falls under subsection 1 of section 4 of the Forest Conservation Act 1980. It supersedes the Forest Conservation Rule 2003. Dear students, in spite of massive change in scenario, our forests continue to be governed by a law enacted almost 75 years ago. Since 1927, our priorities and demands have changed just on the population pressure. Added to this are the inherent contradictions in our forest policies. The constant need for suitable forest legislation has led to enactment of many acts and promulgation of many policies during the colonial and post-colonial period. The requirements of forest preservation have not been advanced completely even after the 1988 forest policy. So that is the end of the lecture. See you in another lecture with another topic, and hope you have grasped the content. See you next. Till then, goodbye and good luck.